The Ratchet and Clank series. It dates back to the early 2000s now, and it's been delighting fans for over 2 decades with its witty cast of characters, awesome arsenal of weapons, and generally enjoyable third-person action. It's also evolved a lot over the years and gotten better and better in my opinion for the most part. And yet, for as many lovable Lombax adventures as there have been, we haven't really seen this core gameplay concept too often in the indie gaming scene. It's happened here or there, but maybe not to this level. Are we now on the brink of having Ratchet and Clank likes? Alright, maybe we don't need more labels, huh? Akimbot, from the same developer that brought us the surprisingly good indie release Pumpkin Jack and is now armed with a larger team and presumably a larger budget, looks to carve a new path for itself. Now obviously, if you couldn't tell from that intro, it is clearly inspired by the Ratchet and Clank series. But is Akimbot firing on all cylinders, or is it a rusty pile of bolts? Well, let's find out in our full review.
Resistance is futile! Nobody can withstand the wrath of the Abyssal Army!
But real quick, don't let us rust away. Like the video and subscribe to the channel if you love indies as much as we do, and head over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames. You'll gain Discord access to the greatest indie gaming community, early shows, and more. Your new community is waiting for you. In Akimbot, the duo of Exy and Shipset find themselves on a quest to defeat the Evilware, a mad scientist that essentially wants to destroy the universe. It's your classic buddy adventure tale with no real shocks or surprises. Unfortunately, while Exy and Shipset are clearly designed to mimic the success of the duo that is Ratchet and Clank, the characters lack that same charisma and energy that makes Ratchet and Clank such likable and unlikely partners.
Why, the last time I was kidnapped, I at least had a 3-2-1 duck! Huh?
Instead, we get a fairly inspired voice performance out of Shipset, while the voice actor for Exy puts on a gruff hero impression that kind of fell a bit flat for me, to be honest, and the two never really develop an interesting relationship due to the game's poor dialogue. It is a script full of bad jokes and senseless banter, a stark contrast to the games that inspired this one. Of course, humor is subjective, I just didn't find this one very funny. But speaking of its inspirations, one of Akimbot's biggest weaknesses is that it is hyper-focused on being something that it isn't, as opposed to finding any type of identity of its own. You'll meet other characters throughout the 8 to 10 hour campaign, but it always feels like Akimbot is standing in the shadows of another game, making it feel as though you've purchased the generic version of Doritos in video game form. I'm all for being inspired by another game or genre, but Akimbot is so flagrant in its attempts that it almost feels obnoxious at times. The main goal of Akimbot is to travel through extremely linear and rather bland environments while blasting down robots, avoiding lasers and other projectiles or obstacles en route to reaching an end area where you'll typically take on yet another horde of enemies or a boss. The game does not offer much in terms of exploration, with the only real distraction coming from crates that are a bit off the beaten path, though far from hidden, which can be smashed for in-game currency. This currency is then spent to buy new weapons and upgrades for those weapons at pop-up shops, which randomly appear as you venture forward, usually once per new area. Other than that, there are a few lost data items to find in each level, but that's about it. The gameplay itself is rather simplistic, yes, but mechanically, it nails down the fundamentals well enough. Exy has a basic melee attack for close range, and then an assortment of different guns, including a secondary weapon that can be equipped. It's easy enough to toggle between weapons via the D-pad, though the on-screen UI doesn't present itself particularly well, which did lead to a little bit of confusion here or there as to which weapon I had equipped. As you know, a great deal of the fun in the Ratchet and Clank series comes of course from its amazing assortment of weapons, but unfortunately in Akimbot, the weapons are rather stale and boring in my opinion. Whether it was the sniper rifle that wasn't all that fun to use, the poison gun, or the laser-based weapons, they all felt flat, lacked some energy, and just weren't that fun. In fact, many of the weapons are more of a hassle than anything. This led to me often reverting back to my standard machine gun to pick off enemies from a distance that way. Even worse, your secondary weapon tends to run out of energy very quickly, though thankfully there are some upgrades that can be purchased to make your weapons a bit better. It's a very simple upgrade system. And despite these issues, while aiming down the sights doesn't feel particularly great, the combat overall is actually serviceable. Exy will also need to rely on platforming skills. You can jump, double jump, and then dash as well to reach otherwise unreachable areas. It is nice that these abilities are unlocked from the get-go and they don't need to slowly be acquired. If you land in water, which is a common occurrence throughout Akimbot, you'll take a great deal of damage, so this adds a bit of additional risk for players to consider before jumping. There are also scripted wall running sections during levels and eventually a grappling hook that attempts to spice up the action a bit, but ultimately these added mechanics fail to bring much new to the table. Wall running feels fairly stiff and boring, almost automated, while the grappling mechanic doesn't feel all that interactive or engaging either. But to give credit, you can't say that Akimbot doesn't try to mix up the gameplay from time to time. Occasionally, you'll find yourself in action segments where you might be manning a turret or flying a ship and even riding a mechanical dinosaur. Sadly, these sections also lack energy, which leads me to my greater point that Akimbot simply feels like an empty shell of a Ratchet and Clank game far too often. There are stretches with no action or life at all, and yet when the game does try to ramp things up, that lame enemy AI, the boring weaponry, it just becomes even more apparent. It's even worse that sometimes it feels like you take massive damage out of nowhere and just randomly explode, which cues the same lame restart screen over and over. Luckily, checkpoints are plentiful, but still, despite having various difficulty options, Akimbot never feels challenging and you'll eventually progress through it. It just feels cheap at times. It's almost as if the developers knew that the AI wasn't going to be very smart, so they beefed up the amount of damage that is dealt to your health bar. The star of the show in terms of gameplay though, if you ask me, would probably be the boss battles, which offer a few clever ideas and phases. They aren't all that difficult either, as health is plentiful throughout the campaign, which is easily gunned down, but still, I enjoyed most of them. Also breaking up the action are cutscenes, which attempt to flesh out the story more, but because the characters aren't very interesting, as we discussed, it becomes difficult to care about these scenes. The cutscenes also aren't always smoothly transitioned into either, making them feel a bit jarring at times, though they can at least be skipped.
Oh, come on! He made a pretty good team, right?
Akimbot does attempt a few other gameplay ideas, such as hacking, and even features a small variety of puzzles. The hacking minigames are rather basic and really not all that fun, running out of steam pretty quickly. These range from pressing the correct combinations of buttons on your controller in order to guiding a snake to the correct location presented on screen. All of these hacking games mainly seem to exist to distract players and are just another way to open the path forward. Puzzles, on the other hand, often put the solutions right in front of your face, so you have to wonder, why were they added at all outside of having them for the sake of variety? All of this is to say that Akimbot desperately attempts to keep player interest, but is so half-baked in everything that it introduces, it just fails to do so. Visually, the game is a bit of a mixed bag. The PC version does have a decent assortment of settings, and performance was actually mostly fine on my 4070 at 4K very high settings, and the HDR does add a bit of vibrancy to the game's sometimes drab areas too, but overall, many of the locations felt lifeless and drab, much like the gameplay. Now there were some highlights here, like the opening section where you're on a beach. Areas like this were quite beautiful. These moments are sadly few and far between though. The character designs, much like their personalities, really aren't all that memorable either. At least the soundtrack in Akimbot delivers some great electronic beats and thumping bass too. The sound design in general is quite well executed and ends up being one of the game's stronger aspects. There are some real banger tracks here. One of my favorites was actually on the menu screen. Voice performances outside of the aforementioned lead Exy were also mostly admirable and at least attempted to breathe life into a pretty lackluster script.
Welcome, intruders. We've been expecting you. Our great and wise Commander Evilware has ordered, crush them, rip them into shreds, impale them on pointy objects, and serve me their data core on a platter.
You know, as much as I wanted to love Akimbot, I just couldn't find that many reasons to. Its forgettable characters, boring action and level design, and equally dull weapons make it sometimes feel like a chore to get through, despite those functional mechanics and the fact that it runs decently enough. It just lacks heart and charm, and worst of all, it just isn't that fun to play. A stark contrast from the smaller indie that was Pumpkin Jack, which had a heck of a lot of heart despite that smaller budget. With all of that said, here at I Dream of Indie Games, we recognize that games are so much more than a number, which is why we review games based on a scale that utilizes our bronze, silver, and golden genie lamps, which represent good, great, and essential respectively. We also have the Indie Krampus for exceptionally bad games, but we try not to talk about him too much. When it comes to Akimbot, this was a little tricky, but I'm simply just not going to be awarding it a lamp because it's not dreadfully horrible enough to declare a Krampus, but it also isn't a game that I'm comfortable calling good. Akimbot is a game that is just mediocre, and while it tries to emulate one of the greats, it fails to do so.